The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. I see the crowd's getting younger. We're all well, for those of us who remember this, we're going to like this lecture today. It's about sex. So, the book today that I'm asked to review, which I enjoyed, I've done this 4 or 5 times, is about Gary Hart. All the Truth is Out. And, you know, it's funny because if we were giving this lecture today, if you talk to people in my office and I mention Gary Hart, you know, I mean, I'm talking about not just kids who are out the street, young lawyers. Gary Hart, who's Gary Hart? Well, Gary Hart was really a big figure in the 80s. What was he, a baseball player? But Gary Hart, which is why I think we pay attention to history, was really, this book is pretty interesting, was really a seminal figure in American political life for a lot of reasons. And we can discuss those. If everybody remembers the classic picture of Gary Hart sitting on the boat Monkey Business with this gorgeous 29-year-old Donna Rice sitting on his lap, and you know, you look at this and you say to yourself, how could you do this? Well, it's a pretty interesting story, and to understand Hart, you almost have to go back. Hart grew up in Colorado. Now, this book, written by a fellow named Matt Bai, B-A-I, I never remember authors' names. My wife always says to me, who wrote the book? And I have no idea. I forget them, and, you know, all you need is the title anyway. But anyway, this is a man who used to be an author a writer for the New York Times Magazine. Excuse me. And he's a big Hart fan. He's a liberal, so if you're not a liberal, you may not like him. But he brings up some interesting points about how the political scene is. Hart, as I say, grew up in Colorado, from a small Midwestern town, ended up going to Yale. I think he went to Yale Divinity School and then Yale Law School. He was one of the really bright people in American politics. Whether you're conservative or Republican, for example, those of you who may not like Ted Cruz, maybe you do like Ted Cruz, who's a senator from Texas. Alan Dershowitz, who's by no means a conservative, said that Cruz was one of the smartest students he ever had at Harvard Law. So when you're talking about brains, it's brains. And Hart was very, very smart. And in 1972, when McGovern ran for president, Hart became his campaign manager. Young guy, got involved with people young, handsome, tall, you know, the whole business, big shock hair. I paid attention to that. So McGovern got the nomination. Hart became kind of on the fast track, and you know, in every business, in politics, you start to see people who are on the upcoming. And this is right after the Kennedy, Bobby era. Ted was still around. So now Hart starts to move along into the 70s, starts to get a name, runs for Senate in Colorado, and he always had kind of a different way about him. Hart was never somebody who was part of the crowd. He was always a little bit distant. I don't say lonely. He didn't have a lot of friends in the Senate. Always did things kind of his own way, and as I said, it was very erudite. And even though he was a liberal in the Democrats, he wasn't a way-out liberal. In fact, Humphrey got mad at him, maybe never forgot it, politicians don't forget, when he said, we're not going to die as the party of Humphrey. Humphrey, in 76, you remember, probably would have been nominated for president, but he had cancer and died that year, and Carter came in. So all through the 70s, Hart starts to grow in the Democratic Party. In 1984, he decides that he's going to run for president. And he really makes a good run against it, except that was a time when Mondale took him apart with one line in the 84 primaries. Hart actually won in New Hampshire. And then Mondale comes in and says, remember that famous commercial from Wendy's, "Where's the beef?" Well, that kind of took care of Gary Hart. But Mondale, of course, got creamed by Reagan. Now, like every political debate or every political election, look at now Romney. He's gone. Who's the next person going to be? Hart now becomes the man in the Democratic Party in the 1980s. Now we forget, we always think back, Mario Cuomo had that tremendous speech, the keynote speech at the Democratic National Convention. And the whole question is Cuomo going to run or isn't he going to run? Now whether he would have or not have, depending on Hart, who knows, because Cuomo never ran. And whether Cuomo had his own issues, who's to say? But by 1987, Gary Hart was a presumptive Democratic nominee. He had the press, everybody was following him, the Democrats were in love with him. Reagan, of course, was coming out. He had the Iran-Contra problem. George Bush was the vice president. The Democrats felt he was eminently beatable. Hart, very good looking, very articulate, very smart. And from the Democratic point of view, this was a man who was way ahead of his generation. For example, in '87, Hart understood the significance of the computer revolution that was going to occur in this country. Understood we had to get in front of it, knew that this was going to change our lives all over, understood exactly how this was going to work. Not exactly, but he really had an understanding, unlike a lot of politicians then and now who are very in the moment. You know, what can we fix now? He had a different vision. He was actually a visionary. Things like the military. He had a plan, for example, that after he got elected, he was going to meet with all the different people in different countries just to get to know them before he even became elected. He had an understanding about infrastructure. Knew at that time America, our bridges are 100 years old. Understood the limits of our military. In fact, in 2002, when we went into Iraq, he talked to the author, and he said to the author, he said, "We're going to win in Iraq," but he said, "You watch. This is going to be a disaster for us in the world. We're not going to get out. We're going to have major problems. It's going to destroy our country in a lot of different ways." So he was very, very astute. Now, it's very interesting also because in '87, all of us here will remember, you talk to people under, say, 40. Let's see, 40 had been what, 1974? Okay. Ask people under 35 if they can imagine a world with 3 networks. That's your news. Just ask them. What are you really talking about? You got your news from 3 different sources. Dan Rather, Walter Cronkite, John Chancellor, and well, I don't know if it's Peter Jennings, Howard K. Smith. That was it. No social media, no Google, no tweet, no Facebook, no nothing. And when did your news come? It came once a day, really. It came, at least from electronically. It came the 6:30 news. Oh, this is Walter Cronkite. Remember Walter and that tremendous influence he had? In fact, when Nixon said, when in the war, Lyndon Johnson rather said, "When I lost Cronkite, I've lost." When Cronkite came out against him on the war, Johnson's famous lines are, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the country." That's the way we got the news. And newspapers at that time were also huge. Also magazines, Time, Newsweek, to a lesser extent, U.S. News and World Report. It was a very contained news gathering in this country. But there had been some changes. And one of the big changes, which was really not fully understood at the time, was what had occurred in the Washington Post back in the 1970s, when Woodward and Bernstein took on the president. Now, before that, you never had any, back in the early 2000s, of course, you had investigative reporting, but nothing like that. You now had 2 young reporters who were no longer part of the establishment, although they were part of the Washington Post. Remember, the New York Times and Scotty Reston at that time was the newspaper in the country. The Times died. I mean, not literally, but they were dying when they were seeing the Washington Post taking apart Richard Nixon, and all they could do was follow along. And the networks were also following along. But that changed a lot. And in what way did it change? You now had a difference in the relationship of politicians and the press. And what he points out in this book, which is really pretty interesting, is this. Prior to this, the 1980s, the press and the politicians had understandings. And a lot of the politicians back then, before they had their, obviously their people, they called them body men, people took care of them. But you could talk to people, so Kennedy or even Nixon or some people you'd have private conversations with and they'd open up. In the 1980s, the battle between the press and the politicians started to become more acute. The press started going after the politicians more. The politicians stopped trusting the press more. You stopped getting as much dialogue and interaction between the two of them. And this is the area that Hart was walking into, and he was warned. You're walking into a vortex. Remember the perfect storm, and they're coming in, and the woman warns him and said, Scotty, whatever his name was, you're coming into the storm, you're coming into a perfect storm. Well, they warned him. This is what you're coming into. Now, the press before, everybody knows that they had taken a pass on Kennedy. Here's what's pretty interesting. Teddy White, who wrote those great Making the President in 1960 and 64 and so forth, and one of the really great reporters. But those reporters reported, you never saw Teddy White reporting in 60 or 64 about Johnson or Kennedy. For example, Johnson, when he became president, New Year's Eve, 1963, 64, told the press, now boys, you're going to see some girls, some women coming out of the White House that may not be married to me. Now, I don't suppose no one is going to say anything. And no one did say anything. Teddy White said in 1978 in his autobiography that he knew of only 3 presidential candidates that he was convinced had not fooled around. George Romney, Jimmy Carter, Harry Truman. Everybody else, Ronald Reagan, Hubert Humphrey, you go right down the line, and they're all doing it. The press, Walter Mondale, no one said a word. Hart had a little problem. He had the Jack Kennedy problem, or as they said, he had a zipper problem. He had been separated, a lot of people didn't realize that in 1987 because they didn't really know him. Once or twice from his wife, and everybody knew that when Hart went off the reservation that he was sleeping around. Everybody knew it. Then he'd come back with his wife, and was it an open marriage? Who's to say? But Hart was a guy who liked the women. And the press knew it. Everybody knew it. But his advisors warned him, they said, and Warren Beatty, who became a very close friend of his, told him, Gary, I'm telling you, you're running for president, it's a different era. And they're not going to put up with it. You've got people out there who aren't just a National Enquirer. You're walking into something that's not the same as it was 27 years ago with Kennedy. It was a different world. Woodward and Bernstein had changed a lot. So anyway, Hart in 1987 announces for president, April. And he's a woodsman, and he goes out, and they always thought he had kind of a weird factor. For example, when he announced for president, he was by himself up in the mountains in Colorado. His wife was around, but she wasn't with him. No one thought too much about it. And he said, I'm going to run a campaign of ideas and so forth. Ending up, as you recall, in 1988 became a disaster of the Democrats, Michael Dukakis, who just got his head handed to him. So there's a good chance that Gary Hart would have been a better candidate than Michael Dukakis. So now Hart has what they call body men. Every candidate has them. Every candidate has somebody who takes care of them. So Hart had a rule that a weekend of every month he would take off to get ready for the campaign. He announced in April of '87 he was raising money. He was different. He wouldn't schmooze with the bosses. He wasn't going to raise money, although if he had to. He was not a hail, fellow, well met type of person. Like everybody, he had enemies. He had 2 guys, Billy Brothridge, I think it was, Broadridge, Billy Short and Billy Broadridge, Billy 1 and Billy 2. And Billy 2 was the guy that used to take him out and they'd have a good time. Now the question is, would he go out and get him girls? By now he's running for president, and now he's got to be a little worried because now they're looking at him. And sometime in April of '87, he has an interview with the New York Times with this E.J. Dionne, D-I-O-N-N-E, who was a big reporter at the Times at the time. And they go in and they're talking about this whole issue of his past and so forth. And Dionne brings up the issue of his infidelities. So, and later, it's interesting, there becomes a battle whether that's going to go in the article or not. This one quote, which became the quote that dooms ultimately Gary Hart. So Hart is having the interview and he's getting a little more irritated, and he's asking about this, and Hart says, I don't understand what my private life's got to do with anything. So Dionne says, well, we got to talk about it. And at some point in the interview, Hart, according to By and himself, says later, I don't care, follow me around if you want. But it comes out differently, because what comes out, as we remember at the time, is that Hart stands at a press conference and says, you guys want to follow me around, go ahead, I've got nothing to hide. But that's not what is said. It's like passing it off and said, you know, I'm tired of this, go ahead, follow me around. And that goes in the article. Dionne says he wasn't going to put it in the article. He said, I didn't think it was that important. So anyway, that's in the New York Times article that comes out in the magazine. Around late April, Hart goes off to Miami to get ready for he's got a big economic speech coming up the next week. All this, by the way, took place in 5 days. That's all. 5 days this whole cataclysmic event took. So he goes to Miami, and he's with Billy number 2, and they meet a couple of young women, Donna Rice and this Linda Aram, I think her name is, who turns out to be a real, who turns out to be the person who's really bad. And at that point, they leave and they go on a boat to Bimini. Now, no one knows about it. Billy, too, knows about it. Billy, too, is on the boat. And later they're saying, are you crazy? What were you doing? Of all things, you're putting this guy in a boat with a 29-year-old woman who, by the way, was no bimbo. She had her master's. She was very smart. She was gorgeous. This was not some hooker they got up from, down in South Miami. Donna Rice was actually a very, very smart, very put-together young woman. So they go to Bimini, and they and they get on the boat, and Hart, talking about reckless conduct, she gets on his lap, and they take a picture, and it's on, right in front of his monkey business, and he claims later he didn't see the name of the boat. Actually, I think he's got a T-shirt that says monkey business on it. And there's like a big sign, if I can self-destruct, please help me. And this Lynn Aram, I got her name here someplace. Anyway, she takes a picture of it. Well, that's the end of it. They stay overnight in Bimini. Hart claims later nothing goes on. All right. Then they leave. Rice and this young woman stay in Miami. Hart, there's another woman, a third woman, who actually, they all thought this Lynn is the one who had called the reporter. On a Friday night, or Thursday night I think it is, a man named Fiedler at the Miami Herald gets a call. And the call is that Gary Hart is meeting a young woman tomorrow night in Washington. And you may want to go up and check it out. Now remember, this had never happened in American politics before. Mainstream media had never, ever run after a president before. Jack Kennedy was taking care of Marilyn Monroe underneath the steps at the Waldorf Astoria. They all knew it. But they didn't care because they covered it. They knew what was going on. So he gets the call. I think it's Tom Fiedler. Anyways, Fiedler. And he says that can't be because they checked the itinerary for Hart, and they find out that Hart is supposed to be going to the Kentucky, I think the Derby was that weekend, or pre-Derby. And he says that's not possible. They then check and find out, in fact, it's canceled, and Hart is going to be in Washington. So now they've got a call confirming, well, what do you know? He immediately gets on an airplane. I think this may be Thursday night or maybe even Friday, actually. In those days, you didn't have to worry about security. And they send an investigator, not to Fiedler, someone else sends an investigator on the airplane to find out if there's a woman who might be looking like she might be hooking up with Hart. They get Hart's apartment in Georgetown, Washington. They fly up, and he stands outside his apartment. And lo and behold, who comes out but Gary Hart and a woman that he saw in the airport. So now his source is dead on. He's got Hart, he's got a young woman, he sees it, he calls back to the Herald, he tells the Herald, whoa, Hart is up here with a young woman. Now that phrase, follow me around, they may have known about it at the time, but now they're hot in the story. So now the question becomes, what do you do? A lot of very good reporters at the time said, I wouldn't have done anything with that. You think I'm going to stand outside a man's apartment on a Friday night at 10 o'clock at night, seeing whether he's grabbing some woman on the way out or staying overnight? I'm a reporter. I'm not a sleaze. But the Herald sends somebody up, and they call, and they send another team of people up, and they stay there all Friday night and all Saturday. They see Rice and Hart go in. They come out. They see them go back in. They don't see them come out all Saturday night or all Friday night. They never see her leave. Hart claims later that she left out the back door, and she says the same thing. The Herald has to back off their story a little bit because they first report that she was never seen leaving, but they acknowledge, well, it's possible she could have left out the back. But they stand by the story. They saw Rice and him on at least 3 occasions coming out of his apartment. At some point in time, Saturday, Sunday doesn't make a difference, Hart somehow looks out and he sees these people outside, and all of a sudden he realizes someone's following me. Because he watches out, and he sees people looking at him, he sees somebody he recognizes, a feeder or one of the reporters. You're now Gary Hart, and you're wondering, think about this, is this woman setting me up? I mean, if I got set up here, why are they following me around? Why would they even know she's here? Hart goes out, and one of his major mistakes at that point is he goes out, he follows them around, and they confront him in an alley. By this time, she's left. Hart conducts kind of an interview in the alley, and they said, hey, Gary, what's the story with the girl? And he says, what are you guys doing here? And they're going back and forth, and at some point in time, Hart realizes it's a tremendous mistake for him to have been in this alley. First of all, he's terribly discombobulated. He knows, he's shocked. They're standing there talking to him, what's the story with the woman? He's saying, what are you guys doing here? Nothing's going on. They're asking him, how long has she been here? And he said, I don't know. Who is she? I don't remember her name. Did she leave your apartment? I can't recall. I mean, his answers are really evasive. He then goes back in. The Herald publishes Sunday morning the article about Hart and Rice. But that, at that point, is not necessarily fatal. Now what happens, you can imagine the scene. Now Gary Hart is, if not literally, pretty figuratively caught with his pants down. And now he's calling Billy number 1, Billy Shore, and his campaign manager, and tells him there's an article coming out that has no substance. They fly in immediately from Colorado, and obviously they're now bunkered down. This is like Kennedy, Chappaquiddick. It's like Nixon, the whole business with all his advisors. The Herald's getting it, and now this thing is like a match. Every newspaper in the country picks this up. Hart, and in the alley, they say to Hart, hey, Gary, you said to us we can follow you around. So now he's got a problem. Now they come in, they're talking to him, and his press agent, this fellow Dixon, does a good job. I think Dixon never talked to him again because he said, I give up a lot for him. He said, I gave up my life. I believed in him. I thought he was the best man to be president. I thought he was terrific. And he said, it wasn't just having a girl. Broadhurst was Billy number 2. Now he and this guy, now they're sitting down and he's fooling around with this girl on a boat and he's back into her apartment. You mean to tell me he can't stay away from this for a year? But anyway, now the press is picking up, and of course now the hounds are out. And now it's very interesting. What do you do now if you're a mainline newspaper? You got the Miami Herald, which has got a huge story going on the airwaves. You've got the Washington Post, which has had Woodward and Bernstein, but you've also got something where Woodward and Bernstein, years ago, this is different. This is sex. And the reality of it is, did anybody care? And you know, one of the things that Hart says later, he raises three questions. The Hart case, and Fedor raises, it's interesting, which are true today. Number one, is it responsible for the media to report damaging rumors if they can't be substantiated? Or should the media withhold publication until they have solid evidence of infidelity? Two, even if sexual advances can be proven, do the media have a legitimate interest in a candidate's private sex life, assuming it doesn't interfere with doing the job? Three, can't the media stick to analyzing his ideas? Those three questions are still valid. So, for example, if whoever, Chris Christie, we find out, is having sex with, or anybody, do we care? Should we care? And part of the theme of this book, which is really interesting, that goes beyond the Hart case, is we've now dumbed everything down on character to really one issue. Not whether he or she is a good president, not whether he or she has good ideas, not whether he and she is even stupid. It's whether he or she is having sex. So if you're going to run, for example, and Andrew Cuomo wants to run for president, now he's not married and he's living with a woman, do we care whether Andrew Cuomo today, if he were married, is fooling around on the side? And this is the character issue, which is now coming out. And it's true, when you look at these campaigns, what's the one thing, the whole character issue now becomes, are they having sex? Are they having sex with somebody who isn't their wife? Now, obviously, it's not as big being gay today as it was, say, 40 years ago. How about some candidate running today who's supposed to be straight, and we find out he or she is gay? You think that person can actually be president today? You got 20 states would kill him or her. I'm saying him because the only woman in the race is Hillary. But let's assume they found out she was gay. Now, maybe she's big enough now no one cares anymore. But some other woman coming up, you don't think they'd care? And that, as he points out, becomes the issue. It's the era of show business. The only issue we care about is who's he sleeping with. So Sunday night, the press is going wild. The Washington Post doesn't know what to do. They're trying to pick it up. Ben Bradley holds a meeting in the office. Ben Bradley's the man who was as you know, the publisher of the Washington Post. Also one of Jack Kennedy's best friends, knew chapter and verse what Jack Kennedy was doing. But now the Post comes the idea, we can't stay behind in this story. We're not going to lead it, we're going to follow it. And you know, he raises a good point with a lot of the media. And oddly enough, one of the people who writes Hart, and I'm kind of summarizing all this, is Richard Nixon, a man that Hart had no respect for. And he says, I don't blame you. These guys go out and they'll crucify you in a minute. But ask them to reevaluate themselves, ain't going to happen. Ask them to look at this reporting, and a lot of good reporters thought this was seedy, it was shameful, who cares who he's sleeping with? But the Post comes the idea that they've got to follow. You know, I read an article years ago about these high school linemen, and I read an article by a doctor, and he said, you know, any high school kid who's over 300 pounds is wrong. That's a danger to his health. And the reporter said, well, what if he's 6'4"? He said, I don't care if he's 7'4". You take a 16, 17-year-old carrying 300 pounds, 320 pounds, which they're doing, that is awful for their health. They can't do it. But you talk to some coach at a high school, say, well, you know, next door they're doing it. I don't want to do it. You know, not me. But as long as they're doing it, what can I do? That becomes the thing with the press. The whole issue with the press becomes, well, we got to follow. And then they go after Hart in a way, because Hart doesn't have a lot of, he's got friends in the press, the bright people, but he's different. Remember Jerry Brown? Remember Governor Moonbeam? You know how weird he was? He's now the governor of California. Again, right. But for a while, Jerry Brown couldn't have been elected dog catcher because he was weird. So now Sunday night hits, the press is gearing up, they're talking to Hart. They contain the story in the sense that they don't know that, the press doesn't know that she didn't leave in the back. They have him with her. The picture never surfaces, by the way, till weeks later. Hart says, I'm going to take to the press. He has a press conference at the Waldorf Astoria on economics. No one cares about economics. The place is packed. Now the Post is coming after him. This man named, I think, Paul Taylor from the Post is starting to write. And now they're going to have a press conference. Finally, Hart says he'll have a press conference in New Hampshire. So he has a press conference at Dartmouth in New Hampshire. And one of the books that Joe before was here, who's always told about reading Richard Ben Kramer's What It Takes, is the classic book of 1988, the campaign of '88. 1988, we talk about how campaigns are different, really becomes an election that changes a lot in this country. And Gary Hart's case changes a lot because now the holds are off from the press. Now they're overtly coming after candidates. Candidates are now becoming very plasticized. You don't get anything out of candidates anymore. They don't talk. And even though this man's a liberal, he said, you look at Clinton and Obama, there's issue platitudes. No one ever talks. Romney, you walked away from Romney. What did they ever say? And the same with Clinton, or the same with Obama. Because there isn't a politician in the world who's going to get caught making something dumb, saying something dumb. John Kerry said something about water in 2004, not when he said, well, I don't usually drink I don't drink tap water, I drink avian water or something. They crucified him. This elitist, and he doesn't drink regular tap water. So they're not going to talk to you anymore. And of course, once something hits today, it's on fire. Well, anyway, he goes to the press conference in Dartmouth. And the night before, he's still in the game. Hart is still the candidate. There's a lot of smoke, but there's a lot of people who are really for him. And the night before, Billy number one says to him, or Dixon, his campaign manager, listen, they're going to ask you tomorrow if you've ever committed adultery. And he said, that's outrageous. None of their business. He said, fine. That's your answer. I'm not going to answer a question. How dare you ask that question? And it becomes the question. Hart goes to the press conference, handles it, does a great job. Taylor gets up at the end, asks a number of questions, says, I want to ask you, you ever committed he asks a series of questions. Hart makes a mistake. Hart starts engaging him. Have you ever, do you believe in morality? Yes. Do you believe in and this whole thing they're going after him, which really is really self-serving by the press and really dishonest. They said, well, Hart claimed is for integrity, and he was claimed that he was moral. And if he's fooling around his wife, he has no integrity, he's immoral, which is a big, big jump. Sending people to a war in which you don't have the evidence of it, maybe that's a little more important. But nonetheless, that's where they come after him. And they start engaging him in these series of questions. Do you believe in morality? Do you believe in fidelity? And then they ask the question, Hart's walking down, have you ever committed adultery? And Hart has walked down there and he said, I don't think that's a fair question. And they kill him. Next day, Hart won't answer his adulterous questions. And he knew it right then. He walked away and he said to somebody, this isn't going to end, is it? And one of the fellows with him, I forget who it was, said, well, you know better than I do, one of his closest advisors. Once that comes out, he knows, it's about the worst answer he could have given. Better, he said, I'm not answering questions like that. It's none of your business. Whatever I've done, and everybody knew, by the way, that he had been separated from his wife. And America at that point would still have given him a pass if it had come out that he was fooling around his wife when they were separated, because Hart never made any secret about the fact they were separated, and so that was pretty well known. But when they get into the wife and committing adultery in your wife, when you're living with your wife, you ever committed adultery, and he says it's an unfair question, everybody at that point says, even people liked him, said, well, you know what, now where are we? That's not going to, I think that's a Tuesday. This all occurs on a Friday. Wednesday morning, Hart walks away, says I'm done. And a huge press conference out in Colorado, and lambastes the media at that time, calls them the hunters and the hunted. And that's when Nixon writes to him and says, I don't blame you. It's exactly the way I felt. For the next 20 years, here's what's interesting about Hart, and it is interesting. Clinton does he apologize? I guess he apologized, and of course he draws that distinction about sex, and that's what happened. Hart started drawing these fine lines about morality. John Edwards and all these other politicians who stand there with their wives and they apologize. According to Hart, he and Rice never did anything. She says the same thing, although she implies to the reporter that maybe there's a little more to it than they've let on. I mean, she's staying overnight with this guy, I suppose there was. He says he just calls her up to Washington to be a friend, just to visit him, but there's all kinds of phone calls to her. They got the picture. He got set up by this other woman, no question. He got $150,000 from People magazine for this picture. So, but even the people around Hart said, but Gary, you can blame everybody you want, but you're the one who did it. You went to Miami, you went to Bimini. After Bimini, you came up to Washington, you brought her up, you called her. I don't think he paid her way up. Now you want to blame everybody else? But Hart's an interesting character. He never bends. You've never seen Gary Hart. I never realized this. Going on no TV shows, he said, listen, my conduct was reckless and I was wrong. But if you think I'm going to stand up here and debase myself for something that has nothing to do with my qualifications as President of the United States, you're nuts. I'm never going to do that, which is a question of character. And Hart, who really would have been very, very helpful for especially the Democrats, the Republicans would never have gone to him. In two administrations, Obama and Clinton, they never really bring him in. And of course, there's a reason why Clinton doesn't bring him in, because now Clinton's there next to, Hart. Well, as long as you're both here, why don't we ask the same question? So that's the issue. And the whole question now is, the reason why this book is pretty interesting is how everything now has changed. And is this how we define things? Is this how we're going to define our candidates when they run, ultimately, as to whether or not X candidate, Rubio, I don't even know Marco Rubio, and if I find out that Marco Rubio has a 25-year-old woman, now, why did Clinton lie? If you want to say Clinton should have been impeached or whatever because he lied, that's one thing. But who cared? I mean, really? I guess we do care, though. He's having sex with a 24-year-old. He's stupid. Now, whether he calls it sex or not, but he's having oral sex with a girl in the White House, I mean, who cares? Does it change anything? America does care. And, of course, the Republicans, that became the defining moment. They went after him. Well, let's not kid ourselves. If the Democrats get a chance, you don't think they would have gone after George Bush and the same thing? They're just waiting for their opportunity. We all know it. So I like this book. It's an easy read. It's called All the Truth Is Out by Matt Bai, B-A-I. It raises interesting questions. If you want to read it, go ahead. Okay, any questions?
What's Gary Hart done the last 25 years?
Not a lot. He's tried to get back in the game. It's interesting. He's done all. He's called Clinton, Obama. He's made himself available. He's worked for a law firm. He's pretty much kept his own counsel, but he's been, well, now he's 77. It's not going to happen now. But he's begged to get back in. And now this author is a very one-sided account on Hart. He loves Hart. I actually think Hart has a lot of integrity and a lot of character and really takes shots at the press. But he's just sat there in Colorado with unapologetic. Question, I'm going to repeat the question. Has the media really changed in 40 years? I saw an article a week ago, Sunday, in the Times-Union, a very good point. Why do some people go down and some survive? Yeah. What is it about some people that Nixon goes down, okay, Kennedy survives. John Edwards goes down, Bill Clinton survives. Clinton left the White House with 65% approval rating. He's still enormously popular. If the press really wants to take you down, which is what Nixon was saying, they're coming after you. And you raise a good point, which is what this author raises, and that is this, because there's a lot of sub-themes in this book. And one of the sub-themes is, we took a man, now again, he's very sympathetic, but if he's right, we took a man who was eminently qualified to be president, who had great ideas, who understood things, who worked, who had his head in the game, and we took him down because some girl stayed overnight at his house? Are you kidding me? This is what America's become? So that's a valid question. Yes. Well, I was thinking when you mentioned that, it's true. Hart was McGovern's campaign manager in '72. He's the one who dealt with Eagleton. And Eagleton, of course, it was that classic line, which we've all heard, do you have any skeletons in your closet? Eagleton didn't tell him. The press picked it up. They went after him. I use the word vortex. It's used in this book. Hart, people always say the same question. How could somebody so smart be so reckless? Hart, now there's a certain arrogance to Hart, and there's a certain self-righteousness, which the author, though he doesn't really, he admits it begrudgingly. And it's like, Gary, you're running for president. They all told him, they're going to come after you. I'm telling you, you got to stay away from these girls. Now, it's one thing, everybody knows, by the way, that Clinton was bringing women into the White House when he was president. And Johnson was doing it, and who knows who else. Nixon might have even, who knows. But the one thing you don't do is you don't go out in the middle of a boat with two women you don't know. Now, his advisor's an idiot, too, for bringing him on there, and they all said to him, what were you thinking? Because they knew if you got a candidate who's an alcoholic, the last thing you want to do as an advisor is say, let's go down to Eddie's and knock it down a few. But, hey, he went. And not only did he go, he calls and brings her back. So that's reckless beyond any measure. Well, yes. They claim they said in the alley that they said to him, you said, when he's standing in the alley, we could follow you around. But he was dead anyway, because now he can't stand up and say, in fact, when they asked Hart about that, and Hart, according to the book, Hart says, what are you talking about? I don't remember even saying that. Which is, now, whether Hart's telling the truth or not is another matter. No one believes this story about Rice, any more than they believe Nixon in the 18-minute tape. I mean, come on. But he said, I didn't mean anything to me. I mean, when I said that, I wasn't saying you guys want, and everybody, I know myself, I thought when you indicated about following me around, the question is, when did that quote surface? I always thought that he had issued that at his press conference and said to the world, follow me around. I guess not. Do you give a pass now to politicians? I think Tower was drinking.
Wasn't there another one who
there's been
in the mall or something like that?
Right. Well, that's the prostitutes, like Spitzer. Spitzer has the prostitute, and now he's paying money, and it's sordid, and it's ugly, and he's paying money for the prostitute. But let's assume that Elliot Spitzer was sleeping with a 23-year-old woman in New York City.
Mark Stanford.
I mean, do we care? Mark Stanford, the governor of North Carolina, he heads off to South America. And now he's a congressman, and so you're right. Some people get away with it, some don't. One reason why Hart didn't get away with it, which is really pretty interesting, because Hart went like this to the press. And unlike everybody else, this is a man who actually, if you want to respect somebody, stood up and said, guess what? There's no way I'm doing this. If you think I'm going to crawl, I got news for you. I'm not doing it. Now, he paid a price, but that's where he was. You got that on film there? Okay. But that's true. But finances may be something different. I would say this. If you were to go back, and the question is, does the press hammer on somebody unnecessarily? I don't think Lyndon Johnson would say you got a free ride with the press. No. Those last 2 years, the New York Times, everybody was killing him. I mean, you read the stories, he's standing in the White House, he's depressed, and he and McNamara are issuing statements that they think the war is winnable, and McNamara internally says, I know we can't win this thing. So, any other questions? Okay, thanks very much.